Hello, my name is Vanya Westerberg. I'm an environmental economist with Altus Impact. I'm very excited to present you this study on the economics of agroecological farming in Haiti, undertaken together with the Economics and Land Degradation Initiative, Groundswell International, the Partenariat du Développement Local, and with generous support from the GIZ and the Casey and Family Foundation. Should you want more information than that which provided in the presentation, please go to the ELD's website to download the full study, as well as see a little movie documentary on agroecological farming for further details. Now it's a timely study because Haiti is finding itself in a critical situation, which is not new, but the current context is particularly acute, with nearly half the population facing food insecurity, not having enough to eat. A situation which has been fueled lately by rising gang violence and civil unrest, which has led to disruptions in market functionings, further exacerbating this upward trend in international food stable prices that we have seen following COVID and the war in Ukraine. And it's particularly problematic in Haiti, given that 60% of the food that is consumed is imported. And in terms of the context, generally there is a situation where we have the government and international donor programs that are extending programs, agricultural programs around the countryside, but there's generally little coordination between these programs, and often, one-off 3-year project. So there's a lack of sort of persistent, continuous investment and support for the agricultural sector. To reverse that situation, the Partenariat du Développement Local, supported by Groundswell International, has worked with 14 peasant associations since 2009 in the northern part of Haiti's Central Plateau. That's a region with about 30,000 inhabitants, using agroecology to reverse this sort of vicious downward cycle. And at the heart of agroecology is the agency of farmers and their organizations to experiment, innovate, adapt, and spread agroecological principles and practices. That is, the farmers build on their own knowledge, first and foremost, for example, qualities of local crop varieties, seed varieties, promote exchanges on what they know works, as well as working to confront practices that are detrimental to soil health, such as slash and burn. And successful agroecological farmers are then working to spread these practices through their own example and through farmer-to-farmer led teaching with the support of the peasant association. Inherent from sort of more a practical perspective, inherent to agroecology is measures that serve to reduce soil erosion, such as contour barriers, terraces, straw ramps, measures that serve to increase soil organic matter and fertility, using manure, integration of crop residues as opposed to slash and burn, having permanent soil cover, and protecting fencing to protect against free grazing livestock, as well as measures to improve on-farm biodiversity and management, improve access to quality seeds, and enhanced plot maintenance through timely and sufficient weeding and control of pests. Behind the rollout of these agroecological practices, there's also a sort of a beautiful governance infrastructure, consisting at the first level of what we call groupsmen, that are 8 to 15 people that live typically in proximity to each other, that mobilize their own resources in a small joint savings and credit fund that's sort of based on trust and reciprocity. And each groupman then works to invest these into economic activities that generate more resources, such as grain storage, microloans, small livestock breeding programs. And at the next level, we've got the blocks that are village level committees that serve to link together 3 to 5 groupsmen in a community. And these blocks are then coordinated activities amongst the groupmen benefits, such as the promotion of sustainable agriculture, seed banks, grain reserves, savings and credit funds, and community health initiatives. And finally, we have the Central Coordinating Committee that consists of elected members from the groupsmen and the blocks, and they coordinate these basically the blocks and the groupsmen across 10 to 25 villages. Should be mentioned as well so this whole, when we talk about peasant association, it's this whole infrastructure. And it also should be mentioned that not all farmers are necessarily undertaking agroecology. You also have conventional farmers that are part of the peasant association that benefits from all the other services that comes out of that work in solidarity and the building of sort of assets at the community level. Now, what we set out to study in this assessment is to see, can agroecology bring hope to Haiti in terms of addressing food insecurity, improving livelihoods and incomes? And that's particularly important because agroecology provides lots of goods and services that are not necessarily known to society because they're not transacted in markets, such as carbon sequestration, disaster risk reduction, biodiversity enhancement. But even for those goods that are transacted in markets, such as fruits and nuts and timber, the returns from those systems are poorly documented. And when we don't we don't measure, we don't manage, and that leads to a persistent underinvestment into this sort of agricultural system. So therefore, we wanted to basically assess what, if anything, what were the returns to agroecological farming compared to conventional farming, using a comprehensive assessment tool that combines both household surveys and focus groups, so both qualitative and quantitative data. So the study was rolled out over 2001 to 2022. We had 3 focus groups in each of these municipalities, San Rafael, Pignon, Mombin, Concho. And as for the actual study, the household surveys were rolled out within a municipal section of each of those municipalities. And this is also where we held the focus groups that then served to understand basically underlying drivers, the motivations for uptaking or not uptaking agroecology, and obtaining some information about prices that are also used in combination with the data from the household survey. And we interviewed some 330 peasant association members, approximately half of them being conventional farmers, half of them agroecological farmers. They were randomly sampled from basically this whole list of peasant association members that the peasant associations provided themselves. It should also be said that it was the farmers themselves that classified themselves as conventional versus agroecological. So it was not decided top down in that sense. And so the 3 municipal sections are covering a total of 3,000 peasant association members, of which we interviewed 330, so about 10% of those peasant association members. And what we're looking to do is really assess what is it that comes out of that one main plot of land. So farmers have several plots, and we're concerned with their main plot of land and what they earn from that one plot of land, less what they actually put into the system. So the price times whatever was produced, less the input costs for a whole year prior to the interview, 12 months prior to the interview. And we also looked at not just sort of annual crops, but also forest income, tree crops. So total income is therefore the combination of those crop incomes and forest income. Okay, so what did our data tell us in terms of the characteristics? Basically, the main differences between conventional and model farmers when it comes to socio-demographic characteristics is that a higher proportion of the households are female heads amongst the agroecological model farmers. I'm not surprised by this. We tend to see basically women often leading the way when we have sustainable land management initiatives and organic farming initiatives anywhere in the world. And so again, not not necessarily surprising. This is just a general picture. And we also have, amongst conventional farmer, a higher proportion are seasonal migrants, 13%, which can also be explained in the sense that they have less tenure over their land. They may be less likely to reap the returns of investing in agroecological practices. When it comes to literacy and education, they're rather education-wise similar. 50% of all the farmers interviewed had no formal education whatsoever, and receive literacy. They're sort of, about 50%. Half of them are literate. Okay. As for then the plot characteristics, interestingly, both agroecological and conventional farmers have on average the same amount of land. They have one main plot of land that they're growing. What we do see, though, is that the main plot tend to be closer to the household for the agroecological farmers relative to the conventional farmers. And amongst the agroecological farmers, they typically dedicate one main plot to agroecology and the two others are to conventional farming. And that one main plot is closer to their homestead than the main plot for the conventional farmers. Okay, in the survey, we also looked at what types of agroecological practices farmers were undertaking, and we can see actually both agroecological and conventional farmers are undertaking a series of sustainable land management practices, intercropping, conservation barriers, using conservation barriers with straw, using manure, using, composting, actually more conventional farmers. And on average, we see agroecological farmers having four sustainable land management practices, and conventional farmers having 3. When digging a little bit deeper, because one can then say, well, what's the difference between these two? And we find that the main difference between the two is actually the degree of intercropping. So agroecological farmers tend to have 5 to 6 different, on average, 5 to 6 different crops for a given plot of land, whereas conventional farmers have between 1 and 4 maximum. So much higher, basically much more diversity of crops within a given plot. And we can then see that here in their growing and harvesting schedules. So a typical conventional farmer will have beans, corns, and Congo peas on his given plot of land. Agroecological farmer will have a lot more going on: beans, corns, plantain, cassava, sweet potatoes, fruit trees, which means that most of the year, there will always be something to harvest. There's not many gaps, and that is good for food security, as the documentary also shows that goes along with this study. In terms of the trees that are grown, it's typically cashew nut, ananas, mangoes, bananas, and also some timber trees, ash, cedar, and oak trees. And here also comes another distinction that we found between the agroecological and conventional farmers. So the agroecological farmers tended to have planted more trees in the year prior to the interview, and also had a higher density of trees on their main plot of land. Now, before digging into our actual economic results, let's look at where farmers are getting their earnings from that main plot of land. And in the communal sections of Boisneuf and Sanssouci, they're specialized in black beans. And as you can see, the greatest share of income comes from black beans. And to a lesser extent, these are the different kinds of crops: pigeon peas, cassava, sweet potatoes, etc. In La Belle-Mère communal section, they are specialized in the production of sugarcane and therefore get the majority of their earnings from the production from sugarcane, along with these other crops. In terms of production costs, we can see that the main source of production costs are seed, first and foremost, followed by labor costs, hired and family labor, food for labor, and then also food costs for those laborers that are hired, and here labor cost covering weeding, harvesting, and planting. Rental of plowing equipment is also an important source of cost. And there's also some labor costs associated with the agroecology, though they were not as high as one might have expected. Again, can look into the main publication for more details. There are no costs associated with inorganic fertilizers and pesticides because I don't think farmers simply don't have the finance for these kinds of inputs. Now, here we've got an agroecological farmer, typical in Boisneuf and Sanssouci, getting his main income from black beans, the main source of revenue, crop revenue or gross income coming from black beans, and then another set of income, or to a lesser extent, from peas, bananas, various crops, and forest crops, those fruits and nuts and timber and fuel wood. He also has a set of input costs, specifically seeds, spending more on seeds than conventional farmers, labor cost, plowing, rental, a small cost item, leaving him with a net income of $1,200 per hectare. Comparing that to the conventional farmer in Sanssouci and Boisneuf, a very different picture, basically having less income from those different other crops in addition to beans. Some input costs not as high as that of the agroecological farmer, but still significant, leaving him therefore with a per hectare average net income of $615. In La Belle-Mer, higher overall gross income, most of it coming from cane sugar. Should be mentioned, after the harvesting of cane sugar, there's some processing involved as well, which therefore explains why overall higher incomes come from gross incomes comes from those areas where cane sugar is cultivated. So with the agroecological farmer in La Belle-Mer earning a net income of $1,600 per hectare, compared again here with the conventional farmer. And so here we've got basically a comparison between average net crop and forest income for the model farmer, like agroecological farmer, compared to the conventional farmer. And we see in both cases the average net income is double for that of the model agroecological farmer. The interesting here as well, though, is that input costs are also higher for both model costs. So it may not necessarily be agroecological farming as such that is leading to higher net income, but also because more is spent on the right kinds of inputs. And I should also mention that what we just saw were averages, and behind that average there's a distribution basically. Whereas here we've got the agroecological farmer, the distribution of net incomes amongst all those agroecological farmers that we interviewed. So you can see some are really able to earn very significant per hectare net incomes, whereas others are in the lower end. But we see on the whole, the average net income for a conventional farmer is in the order of $615 per hectare, compared to $1,100 average net income, crop income for the agroecological farmer, $1,185. We then undertook, because these are just basic comparisons, it doesn't tell us why someone is earning more than someone else. So we also undertook a production function analysis where you're regressing that basically the output. What are they gaining from that 1 hectare of land or one main plot of land? And how does that vary with their inputs, their socio-demographic factors, the land use practices? So we try to basically explain as much as possible. And what came out of this analysis is basically that what really matters is indeed whether the farmer is agroecological farmer or not. All other things equals, an agroecological farmer has a crop revenue that is $434 higher per hectare. However, what's also important, aside from doing agroecological farming, is spending enough on labor for weeding, other labor costs, spending on seeds, and the community. We're controlling for community as farmers in La Belle-Mer doing sugarcane and all other things equals are earning more for that, for cane sugar, from cane sugar. Okay. But what we try to then understand as well is what is it exactly within the agroecological farmer? What is it that's driving that higher land productivity amongst the agroecological farmers? And here we found the only significant determinant was intercropping, but very significant to the extent that when we included the degree of intercropping in this equation, then agroecology is no longer significant. It's because that there's a sort of perfect complements, or highly correlated. If you're an agroecological farmer, you're much more likely to intercrop, have much higher degree of diversity as we've seen in a given plot of land. And one can therefore plot out from the regression results and see, okay, how is total land productivity, the value of what comes out of that given plot of land, affected as we increase the number of crops per hectare. And so we see indeed, as farmers goes, for example, from 2 crops on average to 3 crops for a given hectare of land, his crop revenue increases by $351. And what we say in the regenerative farming sphere is notably that nature is more collaborative than competitive. So that's what we see. These plants, they actually have positive synergies on one another, which therefore explains why we can have an overall kind of enhanced output despite more diversity. And likewise, crop revenues increases as we add more labor days, especially for weeding, high returns to that investment. And here are the returns to every single other additional day spent on the farming system. And one can then make, sort of plot in different values to see what we get in terms of gross crop income. So as we increase, for example, spending on seeds by $70, we can increase gross crop income by $143 per hectare, with all these other factors staying constant, labor days for weeding and so forth. As we add 5 more days, we go from 5 hired labor days to 10 hired labor days. We're increasing net crop income by $164. And basically what this tells us is that those agroecological farmers that we're seeing, they have higher net crop income because they're doing agroecological farming. We see here the $400 jump in income here. But also because they are using more optimal level of other inputs such as weeding and spending on high quality seeds. Further study results of interest is that we took the GPS coordinates for the given agroecological and conventional farm plots, and what we see from using Earth observations is that there is indeed higher land productivity on agroecological plots compared to conventional plots. So it's sort of confirming what we find on our study results. And this higher land productivity is not attributed to rainfall, because indeed there was actually slightly less rainfall on some of the agroecological plots. We have also asked the farmers themselves what were their appreciation in terms of how the agricultural production have changed since they uptook agroecology, and we can see that at least 50% of all the agroecological farmers had perceived at least a 50% increase in agricultural production, and you have sort of more than 10% having experienced a doubling of agricultural production, more than doubling, and up to 5 double production. So more than 10% experienced more than a doubling, and some 1/3 of the samples experienced at least 33% more. So these are really positive results. And likewise, when we're asking farmers, are they intending to continue to undertake agroecological farming and extending that agroecological farming to other plots, 98% were saying yes. So there's definitely a willingness to go further. How does all this play out in terms of food insecurity or food security? We've asked farmers about the stock of food that they had at the moment at the interview, and we see that agroecological farmers have a statistically significantly higher stock of food of 50 kilos on average per hectare compared to 35 kilos amongst the conventional farmers. Using the FAO fee scale, we see a little bit less difference, and we can acknowledge that food insecurity is a problem also amongst agroecological farmers, with 15% of the agroecological farmers still having experienced going a whole day without eating in the 12 months prior to the interview. So more needs to be done to address food insecurity and sort of get to the roots of it. And that's related to addressing the constraints to uptake of agroecology, as there's a clear willingness to invest more in agroecology. And in terms of the most important constraints amongst of both improved farming and agroecology overall, farmers were saying the most important reason is they just don't have enough labor. And there has been, because of the underperformance and the hardships of the of life on the rural countryside, there's been an exodus of farmers or people from rural countryside to the cities. So lack of labor is the most important, followed by lack of credit and not enough access to basically financing those inputs that may be needed. Also, 25% of conventional farmers says, well, they just don't have enough time to go to an association, go to those meetings where they can benefit from all the lessons that they can reinvest into their own farming systems. And then, to a lesser extent, other sets of constraints, such as not good enough land tenure and free roaming livestock. We've also then asked farmers how do they overcome these constraints. And in most of the cases, fortunately, the outcome was yes, we have overcome to a large extent through support from families and neighbors and through support from the peasant associations. I should also mention the twos are linked because solidarity within and between neighboring households are somewhat the initial building blocks of any peasant association. And PDL supports peasant associations to establish savings and credit corporations so as to help sort of create some seed funding for the investments that may be needed, as well as working in traditional conbit groups where neighbors are getting together and helping each other undertake some more labor-intensive investments into, for example, soil conservation structures. But we still have some 10% of farmers, at least 11% of conventional farmers, saying they haven't overcome those constraints yet. From the perspective of the study itself, we've done a lot with 330 observations, 330 farming households across 3 communities. But how would the situation have looked if we were also able to sample non-peasant association members? We would most likely see much larger differences than the ones observed in this study. With a larger sample, we would possibly also be able to look closer at other different sustainable land management practices and how they contribute individually to improve land productivity. It would also be very interesting to assess those wider ecosystem services and co-benefits that we know that come out of agroecology, such as reduced disaster risks, carbon sequestration. Okay, and what are then the recommendations coming out of the study nevertheless? What are the keys to enabling large-scale adoption of agroecological farming? And here we can notably learn from what's already being done. That is, it's key to put the farmer at the heart of the learning process and the co-creation of knowledge and that agroecological transition process. And that also comes by strengthening basically the access to community assets such as credit unions, tree and plant nurseries and seed banks, and helping strengthen the linkages to local markets so that farmers can sell their produce. So continuing to do what PDL is already doing, but at even larger scale. In a medium to longer term perspective, one would also want to see more unlocking of commercial finance. So as we see, farmers are experiencing constraints to taking loans, and blended finance solutions that benefit from co-finance and credit guarantees by governments and international aid, for example, coupled with technical assistance by NGOs, can help improve the risk-return profile of smallholders, making it less risky for any private lender to invest into agricultural systems. We also need to think about fiscal instruments at our disposition, considering that agroecology doesn't just provide benefits to the farmer, but also larger, wider benefits within the watersheds in terms of reduced erosion, reduced mudslides, and more biodiversity, more resilience overall. And so there is a case for helping align societal interests with private interests by having payment for environmental service schemes or introducing intergovernmental fiscal transfers from the central government to the regions, for example, that really are working to fight land degradation. Now, that, of course, also relies on a more strengthened governance systems relative to what we see today. But at least it's good to know we have these options and these instruments at our disposition to address land degradation and help create prosperity we also need to think a bit about trade policies, because there has been a push for Haiti to liberalize its economy, lower its import tariffs, and as a result, there's been a kind of, the markets have been flooded with imported produce. Often that imported food produce, unfortunately, has been subsidized in the home country, which means that there's not a competition on fair grounds here, and that's undercut therefore the country's domestic production and created an over-reliance on subsidized imported food. And that's not a way to lift up the agricultural sector, because, as again mentioned, you can't necessarily compete with imported with foods that have benefited from food that have been produced in countries that have benefited from significantly greater investments into the agricultural sector, in addition to subsidies. And there's significant evidence of this. So we need to basically think a little bit more cleverly about trade policies that can help enhance food production within Haiti to create more self-reliance and less vulnerability to international price hikes. Underlying all of this is also strengthened land tenure. While it's not a problem in our study site, we know that farmers need to be able to reap the returns of the investments they're undertaking into their land, and to do that, they need to know that they can stay on that given plot of land. The land tenure is important. Overall, however, what we can see is that agroecology and optimal use of inputs offer an incredible opportunity of doubling per hectare profitability. As we can see just from our study, a typical agroecological farmer has a per hectare gross crop income that's $437 higher than the average conventional farmer, which is really significant in a context where GDP per capita is 1,829, and less so in the rural areas. We've also see this coming out in the results, in that the quasi-totality of all agroecological farmers would really like to scale the practices. They are facing constraints as well, because they're not able to invest and don't have necessarily the labor available to do so. So indeed, it is due time that agroecology and rural communities start receiving that attention, investments, and resources that are needed to move from this source of hope that we see to large-scale prosperity and well-being at the rural countryside in Haiti. Thank you very much for your attention.